Prejudice against Muslims has become socially acceptable in Britain. That wouldn't be the most controversial of views, except for the fact that it's being made in a speech later today by a minister in the coalition government. And not just any minister. Baroness Warsi is the co-chair of the Conservative Party, and she is the first female Muslim member of any British cabinet. She's due to set out her concerns in the city of Leicester in England. My colleague Martha Carney spoke to Baroness Warsi and began by asking her whether she had brought up this topic during her recent meeting with the Pope.
Yes, I did. I had the privilege of having a private one-to-one meeting, and interestingly he had either read or been briefed on the speech that I had given to the Bishops' Conference. So he discussed the speech I'd already given, and I then said to him that he was uniquely placed, certainly within Europe, to ease the relationship between Europe and its Muslim citizens, and the Vatican is doing a phenomenal amount of work on interfaith work.
Now, you're also going to be talking about the fact that prejudice against Islam has passed the dinner table test. What do you mean by that?
What I mean is that, unfortunately, anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia and sloppy religious illiteracy has seeped so far into sections of our society that it is acceptable for certain comments to be made around the dinner table. And anti-religious bigotry, whichever religion it's against, is wrong.
What do you think the practical consequences are of what you describe as growing Islamophobia?
I think to start to raise the debate on such a serious issue and to have it in a rational and a rooted way rather than in a sensational way is the right way, and my emails and my text messages are coming in the dozens from people.
Well, I can imagine there are people who are very critical as well. I mean, there are people who don't like the fact that you think there shouldn't be a distinction between moderate and extreme Islam. There are plenty of people who would say that there is such a thing as violent Islam, including the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Lord Carey.
There is such a thing as violent people who are criminals, but I think one of the arguments that I will be unpacking...
Completely unassociated with the Islamic faith?
Any religion can be seen to be violent in nature, and that's the discussion we need to have. This kind of selective, sloppy religious illiteracy has got to stop.
Well, there are people who will say that it's, in fact, Islam that has a particular problem at the moment with violent extremism.
And again, these are issues that I will be addressing head on in the speech.
But this is a current argument about extremism in Islam, and we've already had comments from some of our listeners about this. I mean, what is your answer? Do you think that it is a problem particularly associated with Islam, or is it something that's relevant to other religions too?
I think if you take extracts from any religious text, it can be interpreted on all sorts of levels, not just on the issue of violence, but on either issues around the rights of women, approaches to homosexuality. All of these are dealt with in the religious texts, and if those are interpreted and mischief is made, then mischief can be made.
That was Baroness Warsi speaking to Martha Carney. Well, joining us to discuss her comments, we have Douglas Murray, Director of the Centre for Social Cohesion, and Ghaffar Hussain, Head of Outreach at Quilliam Foundation, a think tank that works against radicalisation. Let's start with you, Ghaffar Hussain. We heard there Baroness Warsi not quite answering this question of whether or not you can separate the religion of Islam from the extremist acts that are carried out in its name. Can you?
It's a difficult... You can. I mean, the extremist acts that are carried out in the name of Islam, people who follow that particular interpretation would argue that there is the only valid interpretation and every other interpretation is not valid. So then you get into a theological debate about what is the correct interpretation of Islam.
Well, what about the social debate about using these terms moderate and extremist? Is it not more honest to acknowledge that there are extremists out there?
Of course it is. And on that particular point, I think I'd probably disagree with Lady Warsi and say, but it's not just two camps of moderates and extremists. There's a lot of diversity within Muslim communities, both in Britain and all over the world. And it's probably not useful to just say, okay, there's a big camp of moderates over there and a big camp of extremists over there. We've got people who are prepared to use violence to further political goals, and you do that in the name of religion. There are people who hold what we would call extremist views but don't use violence. We've got people who have very conservative tendencies, people who are, again, liberal, moderate. So you've got a whole spectrum of people, really. OK,
well, Douglas Murray, let's bring you in here. Do you think it's too simplistic, then, to have these two camps? Do you think that does harm the debate?
Well, Sayeeda Warsi referred to sloppy religious illiteracy, and I can think of no better demonstration of that than her own comments on this. The reason why people talk about moderate Muslims, the reason why so many of us spend so much of our time caveating any comment about extremists and people who blow things up and comparing them with the moderates is precisely to separate out the extremists within the Islamic faith from the vast majority of moderates. I don't hear anyone in the mainstream media or any politician who doesn't make that caveat every single time they speak about this area. I think the most troubling thing about this is that Sayeeda Warsi thinks that it's her job as an unelected member of the House of Lords to start talking about theology. It's a very worrying development. The fact is that Britain has a tradition of a religious liberty and freedom of expression and freedom of conscience, which includes the right to criticise and, yes, even ridicule religions. And if she looked for a moment around the UK, she could see that that is done to every religion other than Islam.
Gaffer Hussain, that there are double standards here?
I think all religions come in for ridicule and criticism in the UK. You know, Jesus is always criticised. Christians are always ridiculed as well. I think there is a fear that it is done with Islam, but I think there is an ultra sensitivity there as well of the reaction of certain.
So
Muslims.
what she's really talking about is a general anti-religious sentiment?
There is, I won't say anti-religious, there is, yeah, I suppose you could say, and there's sort of an anti-religious sentiment, but I think a very clear and important distinction needs to be made here between hatred of a religion or disagreement with a religion, which you might deem Islamophobia, and anti-Muslim bigotry. I think those two need to be separated out.
And she's talking about the UK. Is it worse here, would you say?
Worse than?
In France, Germany, countries with large
No,
Muslim populations?
I'd say it's much better here than it is in Europe. I think the discussion in Europe is far more polarised, and far-right parties are doing far better.
So yes, come in,
if
please,
I may
Douglas.
say so, I mean, one of the reasons why it's so unwise for Sayeeda Warsi to talk about this is that she appears not to have any idea of the history that she's speaking into, not only in Islamic history, but in British and European history. It is the case in Britain that people are allowed to criticise ideas, including religious ideas, without being accused of bigotry. It is perfectly possible for her to understand this, but instead she has decided to lecture the British people about a type of bigotry which she has decided to focus on, I would argue, to the detriment of the thing which somebody in her situation could focus on, which is to highlight the fact that the Muslim communities in Britain do have a problem, as they do around the world, with a minority of extremists. But that minority needs to be tackled. And instead of doing that, Sayeeda Warsi is doing the classic diversionary tactic of saying, let's talk not about the problem, but about a reaction to the problem.
But we are talking about the problem now, aren't we? And these comments and the way she's couched, they're not new. She's said these sort of comments in the past, but the fact she's given this speech in her new capacity means that it's given more emphasis to it.
It's simply not
we are talking about
of the Conservative Party chairman to lecture the British people on religion, on religious freedom, on religious belief. It's not her job. And she is uniquely, as she has shown herself, uniquely ill-placed to talk about
well, she can't answer for herself here.
She wouldn't be able to anyway.
Well, Gaffer Hussain, do you think that she is helping things? Do you think this intervention, you agree with some of it but not with all of it, do you think it will actually help social cohesion?
I think it's important we have this debate in public, and I think it's important this debate enters the mainstream and it's not seen as a fringe debate. So in that sense, I don't think it's a bad thing that she raises this issue. I think it's something we need to have a mature debate about. And I think it's a debate that mainstream politicians and mainstream commentators also need to engage in. So overall, I'd say it's a positive intervention, though much more can be done, and I expect much more mainstream figures to also get involved.
Well, thank you both very much, Gaffer Hussain, their Head of Outreach at Quilliam Foundation, and Douglas Murray, Director of the Centre for Social Cohesion.